They said she was worth 1 horse, and by sundown, the whole town would wish they'd never said it out loud. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state below, and if you believe justice doesn't always ride with a gun, stay with me. Now, back to the story. The dust and dry mercy hung low that afternoon, thick as smoke, turning the sunlight into something dull and tired, like even the sky didn't want to watch what was about to happen. Boots shuffled across packed dirt, leather creaked, a horse snorted somewhere off to the side, and right in the middle of it all stood a narrow wooden platform no higher than 2 feet, just enough to lift a person above eye level so everyone could see. And they did see. They saw Naya Redfeather standing there, wrists bound in front of her with a strip of worn rope, her shoulders straight despite the weight pressing down on them, her dark hair pulled loose by the wind, brushing across her face but never hiding her eyes. Those eyes didn't beg. They didn't plead. They watched. Silas Crow stood beside her, one hand resting easy on the rope like he was holding the reins of a calm animal, the other gesturing to the crowd with a grin that never reached his eyes. 1 horse, he called out, voice cutting clean through the murmurs. That's all it takes. A few men laughed. Not loud, not proud, just enough to show they agreed. The kind of laughter that doesn't come from humor, but from habit, from knowing no one's going to stop it. Naya's fingers tightened slightly around something small in her palm, a thin strip of leather worn smooth with time, edges cracked from years of being held too tight, too often. It was the only thing she hadn't lost. Not when the fire took her home. Not when the cold took her people. Not when this town decided she was something that could be traded. She kept her chin level, even when Silas nudged her forward half a step, like presenting merchandise. Healthy, he added, almost casually. Strong enough to work. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of hay, sweat, and sun-baked wood. Somewhere behind the crowd, a church bell gave a slow, hollow knock, like it was late too. Remember what it used to stand for. And that's when he moved. Not fast, not dramatic. Just 1 step out from the edge of the crowd, boots sinking slightly into the dust with each measured stride. Elias Whitaker didn't look like much at first glance. Coat worn thin at the elbows, hat pulled low, shoulders carrying the quiet weight of a man who'd spent more time alone than among people. But the horse beside him, that was different. Black as midnight, muscles rolling smooth under its coat, eyes sharp, alert. The kind of animal men would gamble land for. The kind of animal you don't trade. Not for anything. The murmurs shifted as he came closer. Silas noticed. Of course he did. His grin widened just a fraction, like he'd already decided how this would end. You here to bid? Silas asked, voice light, almost amused. Elias stopped 10 feet from the platform. Close enough to see the rope. Close enough to see the leather strip in Naya's hand. Close enough to see the way she refused to lower her eyes. He didn't look at the crowd. Didn't look at Silas. He looked at her. Just for a second. Then he said it. Quiet. Clear. I'll trade. And just like that, the wind seemed to hold its breath. Silas Crow let the silence stretch just long enough to make the moment feel heavier than it should have been. His eyes flicking from the black stallion to Elias and back again, calculating value the way a man like him always did, not in dollars, not in land, but in advantage, and the grin that followed came slow, satisfied, as if the outcome had already been written in his favor. You are serious, he said, almost amused, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, the rope still loose in his hand. That horse for her. And a few men in the crowd shifted, some whispering under their breath, because everyone in Dry Mercy knew that horse, knew what it meant to trade something like that, knew no man in his right mind would make that exchange unless there was something wrong with him or something hidden beneath the surface. But Elias did not answer right away. He simply rested one hand against the stallion's neck, fingers brushing the smooth coat as if grounding himself in something steady, something real. And when he finally spoke, his voice did not rise, did not push. It settled into the space like it belonged there. That is the deal, he said. And for a moment, even the wind seemed to pause, Naya's eyes narrowing slightly as she watched him. Not with hope, not yet, but with something sharper, something that measured intent instead of words, because she had seen men make promises before, had seen kindness turn into ownership the moment no one else was looking, and she would not be fooled by a quiet voice and a calm face. Not again. Not here, Silas chuckled, low and satisfied, stepping down from the platform with an easy confidence, as if this had become nothing more than a simple transaction. And he circled once, slow, deliberate, boots pressing into the dust, studying the horse like a man inspecting a prize he had not yet touched. Fine animal, he muttered, reaching out but not quite laying his hand on it, respecting its strength just enough to keep his fingers back. Worth more than anything in this town, he added, then glanced over his shoulder at the crowd, letting them hear it, letting them feel the imbalance, the absurdity of the trade. And that was the point, to make it spectacle, to make it something they would remember, something that would keep them quiet the next time he decided to name a price. He turned back to Elias, lifting the rope slightly, offering it forward. Then take what you paid for, he said, and in that instant the space between them tightened, the expectation clear, the pattern set. A man trades, a man takes, a man owns. That is how it always worked in Dry Mercy. But Elias did not reach for the rope, not immediately. His eyes flicked once more to Naya, to the leather strip in her hand, to the way she stood like a line drawn in the sand that no one had yet crossed. And then, slowly, he moved, not toward her, not toward the rope, but just enough to close the distance between himself and Silas, his other hand slipping beneath his coat, not hurried, not threatening, just deliberate. And the crowd leaned in without meaning to, drawn by something they could not yet name. And when the blade came into view, it caught the light in a thin, clean line, not raised, not pointed, just present. And for the first time Silas hesitated, just a fraction, just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. Elias reached forward then, not for Naya, but for the rope itself, fingers closing around the coarse fibers. And there was a moment, a single heartbeat where everything could have gone the way it always had, where he could have taken it, where he could have claimed what the town already believed he had bought. But instead, the knife moved, quick and precise, slicing through the rope with a soft snap that sounded louder than it should have, the loose ends falling away, drifting down into the dust between them. And no one laughed this time. No one spoke, because something had shifted, something small but undeniable, and Elias stepped back half a pace, letting the cut rope drop completely, his voice steady, almost quiet. I paid for the rope, he said, meeting Silas's eyes without flinching, not the woman. And for the first time since she had been brought to that platform, Naya felt something unfamiliar move through her chest. Not trust, not yet, but the faint, dangerous outline of possibility. The rope fell in two quiet pieces, and for a long second no one in Dry Mercy seemed to remember how to breathe, the dust drifting slowly between boots and hooves like it was waiting for someone to decide what this moment meant. And Silas Crow did not move right away, his hand still lifted where the rope had been, fingers curling slightly around nothing, as if he could still feel the shape of control slipping through them, his smile gone now, not replaced with anger, not yet, but with something colder, something calculating, because men like Silas did not lose in public without planning how to take it back. And when he finally spoke, his voice came lower, tighter. You think that changes anything, he said, eyes fixed on Elias, measuring him again. But this time not as a buyer, not as a fool, but as a problem. And Elias did not answer immediately. He simply let the silence sit where it had fallen, the same way he had let the rope drop, without rushing to fill it, without giving the crowd anything more than what they had already seen. And that unsettled them more than shouting ever could. A few men shifted their weight, boots scraping the ground. Someone coughed, and then stopped halfway through, like even that small sound felt too loud. Naya remained where she stood, the loose ends of rope hanging from her wrists, no longer binding, but not yet gone, her eyes moving from Silas to Elias and back again, searching for the part of this she did not understand, because nothing in her life had prepared her for a man who would give up something valuable and ask for nothing in return, not openly, not yet. And that made it dangerous in a different way, a kind of uncertainty that sat deeper than fear. Silas stepped closer then, closing the space between himself and Elias by a single deliberate pace, enough to remind everyone watching that he still owned this ground, still held the weight of the town behind him. A deal is a deal, he said, louder now, letting the words carry. You brought the horse. I brought the girl. You do not get to rewrite it after the fact. A few nods came from the crowd, hesitant at first, then firmer, because it was easier to return to what they knew than to stand inside something new. Something that asked them to question the way things had always been. Elias tilted his head slightly, not in challenge, not in submission, just enough to acknowledge the words without accepting them. And when he spoke, it was not to the crowd, not even to Silas alone, but to the space between them, steady and clear. A deal is only as real as what it stands on, he said. And you tried to stand it on a lie. That word settled heavier than the rope had, and Silas's jaw tightened, the first crack in the confidence he had carried so easily. Careful, Silas warned, voice dropping again. You are a long way from help out here. And for the first time, a few heads in the crowd turned, glancing toward the edges of the town, toward the open land beyond, as if suddenly aware of just how far they were from anything that might call itself justice. But Elias did not look away, did not glance toward the horizon. He kept his eyes on Silas, unblinking. So are you, he replied. And that was when something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because the words were not loud, not threatening, but they carried a weight that did not come from numbers or force. It came from certainty, from a man who had already decided where he stood and did not need anyone else to stand with him. Naya felt it then, clearer this time. That same unfamiliar pull in her chest, stronger now. Not trust, not yet, but the shape of it forming, dangerous in its own way, because it asked her to believe in something she had already buried. Her fingers tightened around the leather strip, the worn edges pressing into her skin, grounding her, reminding her of who she had been before this place tried to rename her. And as the wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound from beyond the far ridge, something distant, something rhythmic, too steady to be just the land settling, she lifted her gaze slightly, just enough to notice it, even if no one else had yet. And for the first time since the rope had fallen, the story did not feel like it belonged to the town anymore. It felt like something larger was beginning to move toward it. The sound came again, faint at first, like distant thunder rolling across dry land, steady and measured, not loud enough to turn heads yet, but strong enough to unsettle something deep in the bones. And Naya felt it before she fully heard it, the rhythm pulling at memory the way wind pulls at old doors, and her eyes shifted toward the ridge beyond the town, just a fraction, just enough to notice the thin line of dust rising where there should have been none, while back in the center of dry mercy, Silas Crow was already moving to reclaim what he believed had slipped, his boots pressing forward with purpose, closing that last bit of distance between himself and Elias. His voice sharper now, no longer amused. You made your point, he said, forcing a smile that did not hold. Now take what you paid for and leave. But Elias did not reach for Naya, did not even glance at her this time. His attention stayed fixed, steady as a fence line driven deep into hard ground. And he shook his head. Once, slow, deliberate, like a man correcting something simple that had been said wrong. That is not how this ends, he replied. And there was something in the way he said it that did not sound like a threat, did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like fact, like a thing already decided long before anyone else had caught up to it. And that unsettled the crowd more than anything else, because men here understood anger, they understood force, they even understood fear. But they did not understand certainty that did not need to prove itself. A few of them stepped back half an inch without meaning to, as if the ground itself had shifted under their boots. Silas noticed it. Of course he did, his eyes flicking across the faces behind Elias, seeing doubt where there should have been agreement. And that was something he could not allow. Not here, not in front of everyone. You are out of line, he snapped, louder now, letting the words carry, trying to pull the town back into something familiar, something controlled. This is my ground, my deal, my rules. And that last word hung there, heavy, like a challenge thrown down whether anyone accepted it or not. Elias finally moved then, but not toward Silas, not toward the platform. He stepped slightly to the side, placing himself between Naya and the rest of the crowd, without making it obvious. A quiet shift, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. But Naya saw it, felt it, the way a person feels shade on a hot day before they even realize they have stepped under it. And her grip tightened again on the leather strip, the worn surface pressing into her palm, grounding her as everything else seemed to tilt. Silas followed the movement, his eyes narrowing, understanding just enough to know something had changed even if he could not yet name it. "You think standing there makes you right," he said, his voice dropping lower again, more controlled now. "You think one cut rope turns a story around." And for a moment, just a moment, it almost worked, the weight of his words pressing back against the fragile shift that had begun, because this town had always leaned toward the man who spoke with authority, who claimed space like it already belonged to him. But before that weight could settle fully, the sound from the ridge came again, clearer this time, no longer easy to ignore, a pattern of hooves striking hard ground, many of them, more than a handful, more than a group, something larger, something organized. And this time heads did turn, slowly at first, then all at once, like a field of dry grass bending to a sudden gust of wind, eyes lifting toward the horizon where the thin line of dust had grown thicker, darker, rising higher against the pale sky. And the murmurs returned, not laughter now, not agreement, but something uncertain, something that did not belong to Silas or the town or the rules they thought they understood. And Naya felt it settle into place inside her. That pull from before, stronger now, clearer, because she recognized that rhythm, not from fear, not from danger, but from something older, something that had been taken from her and was now, impossibly, finding its way back. And for the first time since she had been brought to that platform, she lifted her chin just a little higher, not in defiance, not yet, but in recognition, as if somewhere beyond that ridge, someone had already begun to answer a story she had not dared to tell. The dust on the ridge rose higher now, no longer a thin line but a slow rolling wall that caught the light and turned it dull, and the sound that came with it was no longer something a man could ignore. It carried weight, rhythm, intention, each hoofbeat landing like a quiet promise that something was coming whether this town was ready or not. And the crowd in Dry Mercy felt it settle into their bones before they fully understood it. Voices dropped to murmurs, then to silence, heads turning in unison as if pulled by the same unseen hand. And Silas Crow noticed the shift too, his eyes flicking toward the horizon for just a fraction of a second before snapping back, because men like him did not like to look away from what they controlled, not even for a moment. "Just riders," he said, forcing the words out with a casual edge that did not quite hold. "Nothing that concerns this town." But no one answered him this time. No one laughed, no one nodded, because whatever was coming did not feel small, and it did not feel like it belonged to him. Elias stood exactly where he had been, unmoving, his posture steady, his presence unchanged, as if the approaching sound had already been accounted for long before it reached the ears of anyone else. And that quiet certainty only made the tension tighter, sharper, like a rope pulled to its limit. Naya watched the ridge now without trying to hide it, her eyes narrowing slightly against the light, the leather strip still pressed in her palm, and something in her chest began to shift, not fear, not hope, something older, something that felt like recognition without proof, because that rhythm, that pattern, it spoke a language she had not heard in years but had never truly forgotten. The wind carried it closer, clearer, and with it came the faint shapes of riders forming against the sky, dark outlines at first, then more defined, more numerous. Too many to count in a single glance, and the crowd began to move without realizing it. A step back here, a turn of the shoulder there, space opening where there had been none before, not out of command, not out of agreement, but out of instinct, the kind that tells a person when something larger than them has entered the story. Silas stepped forward again, sharper now, trying to pull control back into his hands. "It changes nothing," he said, louder this time, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "A deal was made." He gestured toward the fallen rope, toward Naya, toward Elias, as if pointing could make it all return to what it had been. "And I do not answer to whoever is riding over that hill." But even as he spoke, the certainty in his voice thinned, stretched too tight against the reality building in front of him. Elias finally shifted his gaze, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to look past Silas toward the ridge. And when he did, there was no surprise in his expression, no tension, only a quiet acknowledgement, like a man seeing something arrive exactly when it was meant to. And he spoke again, low, steady, words meant for Silas but heard by everyone. "You already did." And that was when the first rider broke the line of the ridge. Descending slowly, deliberately, not rushing, not charging, just coming forward with the kind of presence that did not need speed to carry weight. And behind him came more, then more again, a formation stretching across the horizon, not scattered, not chaotic, but ordered, purposeful, and the dust that rose around them turned the air into something thick and golden, the sound of hooves now clear, measured, undeniable. And Naya felt her breath catch, not in fear, but in something that tightened her chest and lifted her spine at the same time, because she knew now, without needing to be told, that whatever was coming over that ridge was not a coincidence, not an accident. It was an answer, and as the lead rider drew closer, still too far for faces to be seen, but near enough for presence to be felt, the entire town of Dry Mercy stood in a silence they had never known, a silence that did not belong to them anymore. The riders did not rush, and that was the first thing everyone noticed, not the number of them, not the dust rising behind them, but the way they moved as one, steady and controlled, like the land itself had decided to take a shape and walk into town. And the lead figure came forward at a pace no faster than a man guiding cattle at dusk, unhurried, certain, and the silence in Dry Mercy deepened with every yard they closed, until even the restless shifting of boots stopped completely, until even the horses tied along the posts seemed to lower their heads and listen, and Naya felt her breath slow without trying, her fingers loosening slightly around the leather strip as something inside her began to settle into place, because now she could see them clearly, the way they carried themselves, the way their shoulders aligned, the way their eyes stayed forward and did not wander, and there was no mistaking it anymore. This was not a passing group, not travelers, not strangers. This was purpose. This was memory returning in a form the town could not ignore, and the lead rider drew within 50 yards, then 40, then 30, and still no one spoke, not even Silas, though his jaw had tightened enough to show the strain he tried to hide. His hands no longer relaxed at his sides but held just slightly away, as if he were deciding what to do with them and finding no answer that fit the moment. And when the riders finally slowed to a stop at the edge of the open space, the dust drifted past them in a soft curtain, catching the late afternoon light and turning everything gold for a heartbeat. And in that quiet, the lead man swung down from his horse with a motion so smooth it barely made a sound, his boots touching the ground like he had stepped there 1,000 times before, and he stood tall, older than most, his hair streaked with gray, his posture straight not from force but from habit, from years of carrying something that did not bend easily, and his eyes moved across the scene, taking in the platform, the rope on the ground, the crowd, Silas, Elias, and finally, Naya. And when they found her, they did not move away. They held, steady, searching, not as a stranger looks at a stranger, but as a man looks at something he has been told might be lost, and Naya felt it like a quiet pull through her chest, stronger now, undeniable. And without thinking she took a single step forward, the loose ends of rope falling completely from her wrists as she moved, the leather strip still in her hand. And the man's gaze dropped briefly to that strip, to the worn edges, to the faint markings pressed into it by time and use, and something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not doubt, but recognition settling into certainty, and behind him, the riders remained still, not reaching, not speaking, simply present, like witnesses waiting for a truth to surface on its own. And Silas finally found his voice again, though it came sharper than before, forced into the quiet like a stone thrown into still water. "This is private business," he said, stepping forward half a pace, trying to reclaim the center of the moment. "You have no claim here." But the older man did not look at him, did not answer. He kept his eyes on Naya, and when he spoke, his voice carried low and steady, not loud, not commanding, but filled with something that did not need to rise to be heard. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and Naya's fingers tightened again around the leather, her voice coming softer than she expected but clear enough in the still air. "My mother," she said, and the word seemed to hang there longer than it should have. And the man took one slow step closer, his gaze never leaving her face. "Your mother," he repeated, as if testing the shape of the truth in his own voice. And Elias, standing just to the side, did not interrupt, did not move, But there was a quiet shift in him too, a small exhale, almost unnoticeable, like a man watching a long line of thought finally reach its end. And as the wind moved through the space again, carrying the last of the dust past them, the town of Dry Mercy stood caught between what it had always been and what it was about to become, and no one there could yet say which would remain when the moment finished unfolding. The word lingered in the air longer than anything else that had been spoken that day, softer than Silas's threats, quieter than the shifting crowd, but heavier than all of it combined. And the older man did not rush to answer it, did not fill the silence the way most men would. He simply stood there, eyes steady on Naya, as if allowing the truth to arrive on its own terms. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something different now, something not just certain but personal. What was her name? He asked, and the question did not feel like an interrogation. It felt like a door being opened carefully, one hinge at a time. Naya swallowed once, the dryness in her throat catching for a moment before she answered. Aaliyah, she said, and the moment the name left her lips, something changed in the man's face. Not dramatically, not in a way the crowd would understand, but in the small details, the tightening at the corners of his eyes, the way his shoulders shifted as if a weight had just been confirmed rather than placed. And behind him, one of the riders lowered his gaze slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them without a word. Silas stepped forward again, more sharply this time, his patience thinning as the moment slipped further from his grasp. This means nothing, he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. Names do not change. Ownership, and that word, ownership, landed wrong now. It no longer settled into the crowd the way it had before. It bounced, unsettled, because something had already begun to crack beneath it. Elias did not look at Silas, did not respond to the word. But his presence remained where it had been, steady, unyielding, like a line drawn that no one had crossed yet. And Naya felt it again, that strange sense of being anchored in a place that had once felt like a trap, her fingers loosening slightly around the leather strip as she lifted it just enough for the older man to see more clearly. The worn edges, the faint markings pressed into it, patterns that had faded but not disappeared, and the man took another step closer, slow, deliberate. His gaze fixed on the strip now, not on her face, not on the crowd, just that small piece of leather. And when he spoke again, it was almost to himself, but everyone heard it. Red feather, he said, and the word carried through the space like something remembered rather than declared. And Naya's breath caught, not in surprise but in recognition, because she had not heard that name spoken aloud in years, not since before everything had been taken. And Silas let out a short, sharp laugh, trying to pull the moment back into something he understood. You come riding in with stories and expect this town to bend, he said, spreading his hands slightly as if presenting the absurdity to the crowd. This is Dry Mercy, not some campfire tale. But even as he spoke, fewer eyes turned to him, fewer heads nodded, because the weight in the air had shifted. It no longer belonged to him. The older man finally turned his gaze from the leather strip to Silas, just once. And it was not anger in that look, not threat, but something far more unsettling, something that did not need to prove itself. And he spoke with the same calm that had not wavered since he stepped into town. You called her a price, he said. You called her a trade. And he paused. There, just long enough for the words to settle. You were wrong. And there was no rise in his voice, no force behind it, but the certainty in it carried further than any shout could have. And behind him, the riders remained still, their presence now fully formed, not as a threat, not as a display, but as something undeniable, something that did not need permission to exist. And Naya felt it fully then, the shape of what was happening, not as fear, not as hope, but as truth returning, piece by piece. And for the first time, she straightened completely, shoulders lifting, chin steady, not because she had been told to, but because something inside her recognized that she no longer stood alone. And as the last of the dust settled around them, the town of Dry Mercy realized, though no one said it out loud, that whatever had begun on that small wooden platform was no longer theirs to control. Silas Crow's laugh faded quicker this time, like even he could hear how hollow it sounded against the weight settling into the air. And for the first time since he had stepped onto that platform, he did not look like a man in control of a story. He looked like a man trying to catch up to one that had already moved past him, his eyes shifting from the older rider to Naya, then to Elias, searching for something he could still hold on to, something he could still claim, but nothing stayed where he expected it to be, and that unsettled him more than anything else. "You come here with a name and expect it to change the law," he said, though his voice no longer carried the same certainty. "This town does not answer to you." And the older man did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to stand fully within the center of the space that had once belonged to Silas. And when he spoke again, it was not louder, but it carried further, like something that had been waiting too long to be said. "The law you speak of," he said, "was written without her people, without truth." And he paused there, letting the words settle, letting the town hear them not as an accusation, but as a fact they had chosen not to see. And behind him, the rider shifted for the first time, not forward, not in threat, just a subtle adjustment. A reminder that they were not just witnesses, they were presence, and that presence filled the space in a way no single man could. Naya felt it settle around her, not pressing, not closing in, but standing with her, and that changed something deep inside her, something she had held tight for too long, her shoulders easing just slightly, her breath coming steadier, and she took another step forward without being asked, without being guided, until she stood beside Elias rather than behind him, no longer shielded, but standing. And Elias did not turn to her, did not react, but there was a small shift in him, a quiet acknowledgement, like a man who understood the difference between protecting someone and standing with them. And Silas saw that too, saw the way the balance had moved, and for a moment, just a moment, doubt flickered across his face before he forced it back down. "She was given to me," he said, more sharply now, trying to reclaim the structure of the story. "Debt is debt, and I paid for it." And the words might have held weight once, might have settled into the town, the way they always had, but now they hung there, uncertain, because something larger had already begun to rewrite what those words meant. The older man turned his gaze back to Naya, his expression steady, searching, and he asked one more question, simple, direct. "Did you choose this?" And the question cut through everything else, through the crowd, through Silas, through the dust and the noise and the rules that had been spoken over her. And for a moment, Naya did not answer, not because she did not know, but because no one had ever asked her that before. Not like this, not in a way that expected truth instead of silence. Her fingers tightened once more around the leather strip, the worn edges pressing into her skin, grounding her, reminding her of who she had been before all of this. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "No," she said, and that single word carried further than anything else spoken that day, because it did not argue, it did not defend, it simply existed, undeniable. And the older man nodded once, slow, certain, as if that was all he needed. And when he turned back to Silas, there was no anger in his eyes, no threat, only the weight of a truth that had now been spoken aloud. "Then there was no trade," he said, and the words did not echo. They settled, firm, final, like something placed exactly where it belonged. And the town of Dry Mercy felt it, not as force, not as fear, but as something they could not push away, because for the first time, the story in front of them was no longer built on what they believed, it was built on what had just been said, and nothing about that could be taken back. The words settled into the dust like something heavier than law, heavier than habit, and for a moment no one in Dry Mercy moved, because there was nothing left to argue against, nothing left to twist into something else, and that silence did not belong to fear, it belonged to recognition. Slow and uncomfortable, like a truth pressing its way into a place that had long refused to make room for it. And Silas Crow felt it slipping, felt the ground under his certainty shifting in a way he could not control, his jaw tightening as he looked from the older man to Naya, and then to the crowd, searching for the agreement that had always been there before. But what he found now was hesitation, eyes that did not meet his, shoulders that no longer leaned toward him. And that was something he could not accept. Not here, not now. "You do not decide what is real here," he said, his voice sharper, thinner. "This town has its order, and I hold it." And the words might have carried weight once, might have settled like iron into the space. But now they felt like something repeated rather than believed, something set out of habit instead of truth, and Elias finally moved again. Just a step forward, not toward conflict, not toward claim, but into the space where the moment had been turning, his presence quiet but firm. And when he spoke, it was not to challenge Silas, not to argue, but to clarify. "You held it," he said. And the difference between those two words, hold and held, passed through the crowd like a quiet ripple, because it suggested something had already changed, something had already slipped beyond being taken back. Silas turned on him then, frustration rising, but it was no longer the sharp edge it had been. Before, it was something strained, something trying to push against a door that no longer opened the way it used to. "You think this is about words," he said. "About what she says, what you say, what he says." And he gestured toward the older man, as if pointing could reduce the weight of his presence. "But this is about value, about what a person is worth in a place like this." And Naya felt those words hit, not as deeply as they would have before, not with the same power, but still there, still present, because they were the words she had lived under for too long, the measure that had been placed on her without her voice. And she felt the leather strip in her hand again, the worn surface, the faint markings, and this time she lifted it slightly, not for the older man, not for Elias, but for herself, her voice steady as she spoke again. "I am not something you measure," she said, and the words were not loud, not forceful, but they carried, because they were hers, not given, not taken. And the older man nodded once more, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no explanation, and then he turned to the crowd, not to command, not to threaten, but simply to include them in what had already been said. "You heard her," he said. "You saw what was done." And he let the words rest there, not pushing them further, not telling them what to do with it. And that was what made it different, what made it heavier. Because now the town had to decide for itself whether it would continue to stand on what it had always been or shift toward something else, something harder but truer. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of eyes looking at each other instead of at Silas, full of small movements, a step back here, a breath taken there, the beginning of something changing not in a single moment, but in many small ones at once. And Silas saw it, saw the way the ground was slipping, and for the first time, there was no easy path back to control, no simple word that would pull everything into place again. And as the riders stood behind the older man, still, steady, present, and Elias remained where he was, not claiming, not taking, just standing, the story that had begun on that platform continued to move forward, no longer held by one man's voice, but carried now by something far more difficult to silence. The shift did not come all at once, and that was what made it real, because in a place like Dry Mercy, nothing changed in a single breath. It happened in inches, in glances, in the way a man chose where to stand when the ground beneath him no longer felt certain. And one by one, the crowd began to move, not away in fear, not forward in defiance, but slightly to the side, opening space where there had been none before, creating a quiet distance between themselves and Silas Crow. And that distance said more than any word spoken that day. Silas saw it, felt it like a cold wind against his back, and for a moment he did not speak, did not try to fill the silence, because even he understood that something had slipped beyond his reach, something that could not be pulled back with a louder voice or a sharper command. And when he finally moved, it was slower, more measured, as if he were choosing each step carefully, not to control the moment, but to avoid losing more of it. "You all know how this works," he said, turning slightly toward the crowd, trying to pull them back into something familiar, something that had always held them together before. "Debt does not disappear because someone says a different word." And a few heads lowered, not in agreement, but in thought, because the idea of debt, of owing, of exchange, was something they understood, something they had lived by. And that was where Silas found his last ground, not in force, but in habit, in the patterns. People trusted even when those patterns failed them. But Elias stepped forward just enough to be seen, not blocking, not interrupting, simply present in a way that made ignoring him impossible. And when he spoke, his voice did not rise, did not challenge. It settled into the space like something steady and unshakable. "Then show it," he said, and the words were simple, almost quiet, but they carried, because they did not argue. They asked, and that was something different, something dry mercy was not used to, a request. For proof instead of a demand for obedience, Silas turned back to him, irritation flickering again, but it no longer held the same edge. Show what? He snapped, though the answer was already clear, and Elias did not hesitate. The debt, he said, and the space tightened again, not with fear, but with focus, because now the moment had shifted from belief to evidence, from what had been said to what could be shown. And Silas's hand moved toward his coat, slower than before, fingers brushing against the fabric as if searching for something that had always been there, something that had always been enough. And he pulled out a folded paper, worn at the edges, the kind of document that had settled arguments in this town for years, and he held it up just enough for it to be seen. This, he said, lifting it slightly, signed and witnessed. And for a moment, it almost worked, the old structure returning, the familiar shape of authority reappearing in his hand, because paper meant law. Here, ink meant truth, and the crowd leaned in just slightly, pulled by the habit of believing what was written. But Elias did not step back, did not concede. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the paper without accepting it. And then he spoke again, just as steady. Read it, he said. And that was where the moment changed again, because reading meant more than showing. It meant exposing. It meant letting the words stand on their own without the weight of a voice to shape them. And Silas hesitated, just a fraction, just enough for those watching to notice. And that hesitation carried more meaning than the paper itself. And Naya felt it too. That slight break in certainty, that small crack in something that had once seemed unbreakable. And she lifted her gaze, not to Elias, not to the older man, but to Silas, watching him now not as someone above her, but as someone standing on the same ground. And for the first time, the distance between them felt different, not measured in power, not measured in fear, but in truth waiting to be spoken aloud. Silas held the paper a moment longer than he needed to, and that was enough for everyone to notice, because a man certain of his truth does not hesitate to speak it. He lets it stand on its own, and the wind brushed lightly across the edge of the document, lifting it just enough to reveal how worn it was, how often it had been used to settle things without question, and for a brief second, it looked like it might still hold the same power, like the town might lean back into the comfort of something written instead of something felt. But Elias did not move, did not press. He simply stood there, waiting, and that waiting carried its own weight, heavier than any demand could have been, because it left no place for the truth to hide. Silas cleared his throat, the sound sharper than he intended, and he unfolded the paper slowly, each crease opening like a step he could not take back, his eyes scanning the lines as if reading them for the first time, though he knew every word, had spoken them before, had relied on them. And when he began to read, his voice came out steady at first, practiced, familiar, agreement of settlement. He said, in exchange for outstanding debt, and the words moved forward the way they always had, the structure of them firm, the tone of them official, and a few in the crowd leaned in slightly, drawn by the rhythm they recognized, the language that had decided things for years without question. But then the details followed, the names, the amounts, the conditions, and something in the air shifted again, quieter this time, more subtle, because as the words unfolded, they did not land the same way they once would have. They felt thinner, less certain, and Naya listened, not with fear, not with resignation, but with a kind of distance, like hearing a story that no longer belonged to her, her fingers resting loosely around the leather strip now, not gripping, not bracing, just holding. And when Silas reached the part where her name should have been, where her voice should have existed, there was nothing, just a line that spoke of transfer, of obligation, of value assigned without question, and he paused there, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough, enough for the absence to be seen, enough for the silence around that absence to grow. Elias spoke then, not loud, not forceful, just enough to place the truth where everyone could hear it. Read the part where she agreed, he said, and the words did not accuse, did not challenge, they clarified, and that made them harder to ignore. Silas did not look up, his eyes staying fixed on the paper as if the answer might appear if he looked long enough. But it did not, because it had never been there, and the longer he stood in that moment, the more the town saw it, not as a mistake, not as an oversight, but as something missing that could not be replaced. The older man stepped forward one more time, not into conflict, but into truth, his voice calm, steady. A debt can bind a man who chooses it, he said, but it cannot bind a woman who was never asked. And the words settled deeper than anything else that had been spoken, because they did not reject the idea of debt, they redefined it. They placed a boundary where there had been none before, and the crowd felt it, that line being drawn in a place that had always blurred. And for the first time, no one looked to Silas for what came next. They looked at each other, at Naya, at the paper still held in his hand, and what it no longer proved, and Silas lowered it slightly, not fully, not yet, but enough to show that its weight had changed, that it no longer carried what it once did, and in that quiet, fragile shift, the story that had been written for Naya without her voice began to unravel, not with force, not with anger, but with something far more final, the simple absence of her consent finally being seen for what it was. The paper lowered just enough for everyone to see it no longer held what it claimed, and that was when the quiet changed again, not into noise, not into argument, but into something heavier, something settled, like the moment after a long-held breath finally leaves the chest, and Silas Crow stood there with the document still in his hand, but now it looked smaller, less certain, like ink on paper instead of authority. And for the first time since this began, he did not have the next step ready, did not have a word that could pull the moment back into place. And the town felt it, that absence, that pause where control used to live, and no one moved to fill it, because something else had already taken its place, something quieter but stronger. Elias remained where he stood, not pressing forward, not claiming victory, simply present, as if he understood that the truth did not need to be forced once it had been seen. And the older man turned slightly, his gaze moving from Silas to the crowd, not demanding, not commanding, but inviting them to stand inside what they had just heard. "You have your law," he said, his voice steady. "And now you have her truth." And the words did not compete. They aligned, placing two things side by side that had never been allowed to meet before. And that was where the real weight settled, not in choosing one over the other, but in realizing they had never been equal to begin with. A man near the front shifted his stance, removing his hat slowly, not out of habit, not out of respect for authority, but out of something else, something closer to recognition. And another followed, then another, small gestures, quiet. But together they carried meaning, because this town had always moved as one when it came to silence. And now it was beginning to move as one towards something else. Silas saw it happening, saw the way the ground beneath him had changed, and for a moment, he looked not at the riders, not at Elias, but at the people who had once stood behind him without question, and what he found there was not defiance, not hostility, but distance, a space that had opened and would not close again the way it once had. And he let out a breath he had been holding too long, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the edge in him softening not from surrender, but from understanding that the moment had moved beyond him, that what had been built on assumption could not stand where truth had been spoken. And slowly, without ceremony, he folded the paper back along its worn creases, not with the same confidence he had shown before, but with a quiet finality, like a man putting something away that no longer served its purpose. And Naya watched him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm she had not felt in years, because this was not about winning. It was about no longer being held, her fingers relaxing fully now, the leather strip resting lightly in her palm instead of being clutched like a lifeline. And the older man turned back to her, his expression unchanged but softer in the smallest ways. "You stand as you choose now," he said, and the words carried no instruction, no expectation, just a space being given where none had existed before. And Naya felt it, that space, wide and unfamiliar. And for a moment she simply stood there, breathing it in, understanding it. And then she took a step forward, not away from the town, not toward the riders, but forward into herself, into a place where her voice belonged. And as she did, Elias stepped back half a pace, just enough to give her the center, not claiming it, not holding it, but making room. And that small movement said more than anything else, because it showed what this moment had always been about, not taking, not trading, but returning. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the dust of dry mercy. The story that had begun with a price ended not with a fight, not with a victory, but with something far quieter, far more lasting. A woman no longer defined by what had been said about her, but by what she had finally been allowed to say for herself. The sun had begun its slow fall behind the ridge, stretching long shadows across the dry ground of dry mercy, and for the first time that day, the town felt still in a way it had not known before, not tense, not waiting, but quiet, as if something had finally settled into place that no one could push back out again. And Naya stood there in that silence, feeling the weight of it shift from something pressing down on her to something holding her steady, her hand still loosely around the worn leather strip, no longer a shield, no longer a reminder of loss, but something else now, something that had led her back to herself. And she looked once toward the older man, meeting his gaze not as someone seeking permission, but as someone acknowledging a truth that had been returned, and he gave a small nod, not as a command, not as a direction, but as recognition. And behind him the riders remained where they were, not moving forward, not claiming anything, simply present, as they had been from the moment they arrived. And that presence no longer felt like pressure, it felt like space, space that had been opened and would not be closed again. Elias stood a few steps behind her now, his posture unchanged, his expression quiet, as if the outcome had never been his to claim, and perhaps it never was, because he did not step forward, did not take hold of the moment. He remained where he was, letting it belong to her. And that was the difference, the thing the town would remember long after the dust had settled, that he had not taken. He had made room, and Naya drew a slow breath, the air cooler now as evening crept in, carrying the faint scent of distant grass and something softer than the harsh dryness of midday. And she took one more step, then another, moving past the place where she had stood bound, past the edge of the platform, into the open ground that had once felt like a stage and now felt like something else entirely. And no one stopped her, no voice rose to call her back, no hand reached to claim what had already been released. And that silence followed her as she moved, not empty, but full of understanding. And when she reached the older man, she paused, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, and she lifted the leather strip slightly, just enough for him to see it clearly one last time, and then she lowered it again, holding it close, not offering it, not giving it away, because it was hers, fully, completely, and he inclined his head once more, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. And then he turned, stepping back toward his horse, not as someone leading, but as someone allowing, and the riders shifted with him, their movement as measured as before, not rushing, not pulling her along, simply opening a path where one had not existed. And Naya stood there for one last moment, looking back across the town, not with anger, not with regret, but with clarity, seeing it for what it was and what it had been, and understanding that it no longer held her place within it. And then she turned, stepping forward into the space that had been made, her steps steady, her posture unbroken. And as she passed Elias, she paused just long enough to meet his eyes. And there was no need for thanks, no need for words, because what had been done did not ask for anything in return, and he gave a slight nod, the same quiet acknowledgement he had given from the beginning. And then she moved on, and the riders began to turn with her, their presence shifting from witness to escort, not as guards, not as claim, but as something else, something closer to belonging. And behind them, dry mercy remained where it was, unchanged in its buildings, unchanged in its dust, but not unchanged in its understanding. Because something had been seen that could not be unseen, something had been spoken that could not be taken back. And as the last light of day slipped across the ridge, casting everything in a softer glow, the story that had begun with a price ended with something far quieter, far stronger. A woman walking away not as something traded, but as someone who chose where she would stand. And in that choice, the meaning of everything that had happened shifted, settling into the kind of truth that did not need to be repeated, only remembered.